This is the third in a series of videos in which I am restoring this Creed 7B Mark I Teleprinter. In the previous video I got as far as removing all the major assemblies from the base unit, and in this video I want to remove all the wiring from the base, and that way I can completely strip the base down, decide whether it needs repainting, give it a really good clean, and then from that point on I can start reassembling and putting the various parts back on as I get them restored, and hopefully get the entire unit working again. So far what I've done since the last video is take off all the remaining small parts from the top. This is obviously now upside down. We can see the wiring underneath. I've taken off the top housing that was the motor mount, so we'll put that to one side. What I want to do now, so I can take all the wiring out, is remove the two leads. So we've got two leads. We've got one that carries the signals, and we've got one that feeds power into the unit. Now the wiring looks very shoddy and tatty, but it's not a huge issue on this machine because it is only 24 volts. Most of it looks fine. It does appear that we've got some additions to the unit that weren't original. So there are some modifications, I believe, that were there to suppress noise. In fact, one of the components we'll be looking at later on is a noise suppressor and filter. That was on the top side, feeding power to the motor. So, as I say, the first job now is to get the control lead off. It's fairly easy, they're all on screw terminals, and the only real problem here is that the four wires on the end are all exactly the same colour. So there are various things I can do here to try to identify which colour's which, but the method I use most when it's something like this is I'll take a piece of single core wire, I will wrap it round the wire I'm taking off, and then I will wrap the other half around the original terminal and then cut it so that when I come to reassemble I'll have them colour coded. So I'll do the first one on camera, and then I'll switch the camera off and come back when I've done all the rest. So loosen off the screw. Won't bother putting the washers back on at this point. Okay, and then we've got a loop that I can put the wire through. I can then put the screw back into the terminal block. I can screw that on. I'll cut it, and now I've got a colour coded reference for putting the wire back on, and I use different colours for each one, of course. So I'll do all the rest and then I'll come back on camera. Okay, so I've marked up all the wires, disconnected them, and they are now colour coded, so I know which one goes back onto which terminal. And I can now withdraw this particular wire from the chassis. The wire's in surprisingly good condition, so I'm hoping I won't have to replace it, but even if we do, at least we know how to rewire it. So the second one is the power cable, and there are only 3 wires on here. And this is in a fairly poor condition at the end, it's all cracked. Feels fairly flexible further down, so I think I might be able to get away with just cutting the end few inches off. And because I intend to do that, what I'm going to do is save time by not having to colour code these, and I will just cut them off, leaving enough so I can identify the two ends when I come to reassemble it. So I'll cut that one off, and that one, as you can see, is very brittle, so that would definitely need either replacing or hopefully just shortening, so where it's been protected inside the outer sheath, hopefully it's in a much better condition. And I can now pull that out through the hole in the chassis as well. Okay, so that's the two cables out of the way. The next step is to get the rest of the wiring out. Now, I've already taken all the screws out. There's a very large pile of screws, which you can see sitting back there, that were holding all this in place. So I've obviously taken plenty of photographs of all this before I started dismantling it. I've only actually had to unsolder 2 wires, and that was from the top where the motor filter was arranged, and the only thing I've got left now to disconnect is the switches at the end. So a bit of an odd arrangement, so I'm just going to quickly figure out exactly what I need to disconnect, and then I should be able to lift the entire wiring loom out of the base. Okay, so I have the switch disconnected. All the parts are unscrewed. There's nothing actually now screwed to the chassis as far as I'm aware, so I should be able to lift the entire wiring loom out of the chassis, and that will leave us with just the bare chassis to work on. So let's see if we can actually do that. Okay, so that is the entire wiring loom removed. As you can see, there were just 2 wires I had to desolder, but all the rest was the screw terminals, or was just plugged in, or it was just fittings that I disconnected and removed intact with the wiring. So we've got a large resistor down here. This is what also limits the current in the loop. And I'll put this to one side and we'll have a look at the chassis. Okay, so we'll get back to the wiring loom in another video. In the meantime, I'll just make sure I've collected all the bits and pieces that are attached to the chassis. So a few spacers on there. I will remove this switch lever. This is the stop switch actuator. This is what allows the machine to turn itself off based on a command that it receives. So the chassis looks in very good condition. I'm not sure if it's been repainted or not. There's a little bit of corrosion. I'll have a closer look at it and decide whether I want to strip it completely and repaint it. I somehow doubt that I'll need to. The paint's in very good condition. So that's as far as I'm going to strip the chassis, other than cleaning it and touching up any missing paint. I'm leaving this bracket in place. I mentioned earlier that I didn't really want to remove the major castings because they are set up when this is manufactured using a special jig, which I don't have. So what I've done is I've used this as the reference point in this direction, and it's obviously been aligned at some point when it was manufactured to give a face on here. This is a machined face that is perpendicular to this axis of the machine. This is where the main print head selector goes, and this is actually on pins. It's the only part of the assembly that's on pins, and that means that this will give us a very good axis on which to work. So we have an axis in this direction and an axis in this direction, so I should be able to use these two to allow me to line up the others and make sure that anything that's supposed to be parallel with this can be adjusted, and the same with this. I can get everything aligned, and then it's just a case of getting it in line to make sure nothing binds up, and the machine can be set up to function properly. There are no height adjustments on the main castings, so as long as they're clean, then they should be fine. So the next step is I'll get this cleaned. I'll look at it in the next video, and we'll start looking at getting the wiring loom repaired where it needs it and reinstalled into the chassis.